Asterisk deep beneath the forgotten red hollow depot, Margaret Hale pulled open the door of a hidden rail car. Inside, preserved by time, lay a folded olive green coat. For 10 years, a German shepherd named Ranger had howled into the night, waiting for a train that never came. Now, he stepped forward, resting his head gently against the fabric. His long watch was finally over. Tucked inside the coat was a note: "If you are reading this, it means the sound led you here too." I knew he would wait. The promise wasn't broken. It was just waiting to be found. Asterisk, some promises don't fade with time, they wait, quietly, where they were last made. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., when the town of Red Hollow lay wrapped in a kind of silence that made even the wind hesitate, a lone German shepherd would lift his head and howl toward a stretch of empty track that hadn't seen a train in over a decade. The sound wasn't loud. Not desperate. But steady, like a signal sent to something no one else could hear. Folks who lived nearby had grown used to it, though none of them could explain why the dog always chose that exact moment, or why he never missed a single night. They called him Ranger. A name someone had given him years ago when he first appeared at the station. Younger then. His coat darker. His posture sharper, as if he still belonged to someone who had taught him purpose. The station itself, Red Hollow Depot, stood weathered and hollowed by time.
Buddy.
Its wooden beams creaking softly with every shift of the night air. Its old ticket window coated in dust that no one bothered to wipe away anymore. Paint peeled from the walls like old memories, and the platform stretched out beside rusted rails that cut through the earth like scars, long forgotten, but never truly healed. No trains came through anymore. No announcements echoed across the hills. Just the occasional whisper of wind slipping through broken boards, carrying with it the faint scent of iron and rain. And still, every morning just after sunrise, Ranger would take his place at the same spot near the edge of the platform. Sitting upright. Ears alert. Eyes fixed on the distant curve where the tracks disappeared into the trees. He didn't beg. He didn't wander far. He simply waited. Some said he had been there nearly 10 years. Others claimed longer. A few insisted he once belonged to a soldier, a man who had stepped onto a train and never returned. But no one knew for sure. Only Margaret Hale, the station's former ticket clerk who still passed by out of habit, had watched the years stack quietly around that dog. And lately, she had begun to notice something different. Because in the last few nights, just before that 2:17 howl, Ranger had started turning his head, not toward the tracks, but toward the old, locked freight room beneath the station. As if something beneath the wood and stone had begun to remember him, too.
I hear something in there.
Margaret Hale had spent most of her life listening to the quiet language of places others had forgotten. And Red Hollow had always been one of them. But what she felt now was different. As if the station itself had begun to stir after years of holding its breath. And it started 3 nights ago. When she noticed Ranger shift before his usual call. His ears tilting not toward the distant bend of track, but toward the old freight room sealed beneath the platform. A place no one had opened in decades. Its door warped shut by time and weather. Its lock rusted into silence. She had paused at the edge of the platform that evening, her wool coat pulled tight against the chill. Watching the dog stand slowly. His body tense in a way she had never seen before. And instead of howling into the empty night, he stepped toward the far corner where the wooden boards darkened with age. Placing one paw carefully against the ground as if testing something unseen beneath it. Then looking back at her with those steady amber eyes that carried a question she could not yet understand. The next morning, when the light came pale and thin across the hills, Margaret returned with a small crowbar she had not used in years. Her hands trembling not from age, but from a quiet certainty that something had changed. And Ranger was already there waiting. Sitting beside that same spot. His tail still. His gaze fixed downward. The wood groaned softly as she pressed the metal edge between the boards. Each movement slow and deliberate. The sound echoing faintly in the hollow space beneath. And for a moment she hesitated, listening. Because there was something else there now. Something so subtle it might have been imagination. A faint vibration that rose and faded like a distant echo of motion long gone. Ranger lowered his head, pressing his nose to the gap as it widened, letting out a low breath that was not quite a growl, not quite a whine, but something deeper. Something that felt like recognition. When the first plank finally gave way, a breath of cold air slipped upward from the darkness below, carrying the scent of old metal and earth untouched for years. And Margaret felt it then. That strange pull in her chest. The kind that comes when a story you thought had ended begins to open again. Quietly. Without asking permission. And she realized with a slow, steady certainty that whatever Ranger had been waiting for all this time had not been lost. Only hidden. And perhaps, after all these years, it was finally ready to be found. The opening in the floor revealed a narrow set of wooden steps descending into shadow. Each one worn smooth as if they had once carried more weight than time alone. And Margaret hesitated at the edge. One hand gripping the splintered beam for balance, while Ranger moved without fear. Placing his paws carefully on the first step.
I hear something in there.
Then the next. His body steady.
Arf,
Guided by something older than sight. The air grew cooler as they descended, thick with the scent of iron and damp earth. And somewhere below there came a faint, rhythmic sound. So soft it might have been mistaken for imagination. Yet steady enough to feel almost intentional. Like the echo of something that refused to fade. At the bottom, the space opened into a low chamber reinforced with old steel beams. Their surfaces coated in rust that shimmered faintly in the thin beam of Margaret's flashlight. And along one wall ran a set of narrow tracks, smaller than the main line above. Disappearing into a tunnel that curved into darkness. A hidden rail long forgotten by maps and memory. Ranger stopped in the center of the room. His ears lifting high. His breathing slowing as he turned his head slightly. Listening not with curiosity, but with recognition. As if the silence itself carried a voice only he could hear. And then he stepped forward. His nails clicking softly against the stone as he followed the track a few feet before lowering himself to the ground. Resting his chest against the cold surface. Eyes fixed on a single point ahead. Margaret followed. Her light sweeping across the floor until it caught the edge of something half buried beneath dust and time. A metal box no larger than a suitcase. Its corners worn but intact. And beside it lay a faded strip of fabric. Olive green. The kind she had seen decades ago on uniforms carried through this very station when trains still came and went with purpose. Her breath caught as she knelt. Brushing the dust away with trembling fingers. Revealing a name stitched faintly into the cloth. Letters softened by years but still there. Still holding on. Ethan Cole. And for a moment the entire space seemed to shift. As if the past had leaned closer, waiting to be heard again. While behind her, Ranger let out a low, quiet sound. Not of fear. Not of warning. But of something deeper. Something that felt like the beginning of an answer finally rising to the surface. Margaret did not open the metal box right away. Because something in the stillness of that underground chamber felt too complete to disturb too quickly. As if the space had been holding its breath for years and deserved a moment before being asked to speak. And instead, she sat back on her heels. Her flashlight resting against her knee. Its beam casting long shadows along the narrow rails that disappeared into the tunnel ahead. Ranger remained exactly where he had lowered himself. His body calm but alert. His gaze fixed on the same unseen point, as if whatever he sensed was not behind them in the past, but still present somewhere just beyond the curve of darkness. Waiting patiently. The faint rhythmic sound returned. Barely audible. A soft pulse that seemed to echo through the metal beams and into the floor beneath her hands. Not mechanical. Not natural. But something in between. like the memory of movement rather than movement itself. Margaret reached out slowly, brushing her fingers across the surface of the box, feeling the cool metal beneath the thin layer of dust. And when she finally lifted the lid, it opened with surprising ease, as though it had never intended to stay closed. Inside were items arranged with quiet care. A folded journal, a small compass with a cracked glass face, and a train ticket yellowed by time. Its ink faded but still legible. One way. Red Hollow to North Ridge. Never stamped. Never used. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal. The pages worn but intact. And the handwriting inside steady, deliberate. The kind of script that came from someone who measured their thoughts carefully before letting them rest on paper. The first entry was dated 10 years ago. The same winter the train stopped running through this town. And as her eyes moved across the lines, she felt the weight of something unfinished begin to settle into place.
Keep watch, buddy.
Words about waiting.
I hear something in there.
About a signal that did not come. About staying close to the tracks because leaving felt like breaking a promise that had not yet been fulfilled. Behind her, Ranger shifted slightly. Not rising, but leaning forward just enough to press his chin against the cold stone. His ears tilting again toward the tunnel as if listening for footsteps that had been delayed. Not lost. And Margaret realized then that whatever story had been left behind in this hidden place had not ended in silence. It had simply been waiting for someone who still remembered how to listen. Margaret turned another page slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. And the handwriting began to change. Not in style, but in weight. The lines pressing deeper into the page as if each word carried more urgency than the last. And the entries spoke of nights spent beneath the station. Of a signal that came and went like a whisper through steel. Of footsteps he could almost hear but never quite reach. Ethan wrote about staying close to the hidden track because something told him that leaving would mean missing the one moment that mattered. The one chance to return to what he had left behind. And again, he mentioned the dog. Not by name, but as him. Always with a quiet certainty that the dog would understand. That he would wait. That he would not give up on a promise even when the world above had already moved on. Margaret felt her chest tighten as she read. Her eyes lifting slowly toward Ranger, who had not moved from his place. His body still. His breathing steady. As if he had known all along that this was where the story had paused. The faint pulse in the walls grew slightly stronger. Not louder, but clearer. Like a rhythm finding its way back into memory. And the air itself seemed to carry a strange warmth now. Subtle but undeniable. As though the space beneath the station was no longer empty, but quietly alive with something that had been waiting to be noticed. She turned to the final pages, where the ink had begun to fade. And there, written with a steadiness that felt almost like calm acceptance, was a single line repeated twice. If the train does not come, I will follow the sound instead. And beneath it, a simple drawing. A curved line disappearing into darkness. Marked with a small arrow pointing deeper into the tunnel. Margaret closed the journal gently. Her hands resting on its cover as she let the meaning settle. And for the first time she understood that Ethan had not simply waited here. He had chosen to go forward. To follow whatever had been calling from beyond the reach of the known tracks. Beside her, Ranger finally rose to his feet. His movement quiet but certain. And without looking back, he stepped toward the tunnel. Pausing only once to glance at her. Not asking. Not hesitating. But inviting. As if the path ahead was no longer something to question. But something that had already begun. The tunnel welcomed them with a silence that felt deeper than the space they had just left. A silence that did not simply exist, but seemed to listen. As Margaret followed a few careful steps behind Ranger. Her flashlight casting a narrow beam that revealed steel tracks stretching forward into a curve that swallowed both light and certainty. The air grew warmer the farther they moved, carrying with it a faint metallic scent mixed with something else. Something softer. Almost like the lingering trace of breath in a place that should have been long abandoned. And beneath her boots, the ground no longer felt entirely still. There was a subtle vibration. Steady and rhythmic. Like a pulse traveling through the rails themselves. Ranger walked with quiet confidence. His movements measured. His ears shifting slightly with each step as if he were following something just ahead. Something invisible yet undeniable. And every few feet he would pause briefly. Lowering his head. Listening. Then continuing forward as though the path had already been mapped somewhere beyond sight. Margaret tightened her grip on the flashlight. Her heart beating a little faster. Not from fear, but from the growing sense that they were no longer uncovering a story.
I hear something in there.
They were stepping into it. The tunnel walls narrowed. The steel beams overhead arching lower. Their surfaces catching the light in dull reflections that flickered with each movement. And then, as they rounded the bend, the space opened into another chamber. Larger than the first. Where the tracks ended abruptly at a small, stationary rail car. Its exterior worn but intact. As though it had been waiting in place rather than forgotten. The faint rhythmic sound grew clearer here. Not loud. Not mechanical. But present. Like a steady echo of motion that had never fully stopped. And Ranger slowed. His steps softer now. His body lowering slightly as he approached the rail car. His tail still. His gaze fixed on the closed door ahead. Margaret stopped a few feet behind him. The beam of her light settling on the metal surface. Where faint markings could still be seen beneath the dust. Numbers, letters. And just beside the handle, etched carefully into the metal, a name she now recognized without needing to read it fully. Ranger let out a soft breath. Then stepped closer. Pressing his nose gently against the door. Not pushing. Not scratching. Simply resting there. As if he had finally reached the place he had been searching for.
Keep watch, buddy.
And for the first time in 10 years, he did not look back. Margaret did not reach for the handle immediately. Because something in the stillness of that moment felt complete in a way she could not explain. As if the years of waiting had gathered here, inside this quiet chamber. And opening the door too quickly might scatter something fragile that had taken a decade to form. Ranger remained with his nose resting gently against the cold metal. His eyes half closed. Not in sleep, but in recognition. His breathing slow and even. As though he had finally found the place where his waiting belonged. The faint rhythm in the air seemed to center around the rail car now. A soft, steady pulse that moved through the steel and into the ground beneath them. And Margaret felt it in her fingertips as she stepped closer. Lifting her hand toward the handle with a hesitation that came not from fear, but from understanding that whatever lay beyond this door was not just an answer, but a turning point. When her fingers finally closed around the metal, it was warmer than she expected. Not by much. But enough to make her pause. And slowly, carefully, she pulled. The door opened without resistance. The hinges releasing a soft sound that echoed gently through the chamber. And the beam of her flashlight slipped inside. Revealing a narrow interior lined with worn benches and scattered belongings. All left exactly where they had once been placed.
Keep watch, buddy.
As though time had stepped aside rather than passed through. There, on the far seat, lay a folded coat. Olive green. The fabric aged but preserved. And beside it, a small tin cup. Its surface dulled but clean. And the air inside carried a faint warmth that did not belong to the underground. A warmth that felt recent. Subtle, but undeniable. Ranger stepped forward. Climbing carefully into the rail car. His movements slow, deliberate. And when he reached the coat, he lowered himself beside it. Resting his head gently against the fabric. his eyes closing fully this time. Not with exhaustion, but with a quiet peace that had been missing until now. Margaret stood at the doorway. Her light steady. Her breath held in a silence that felt almost sacred. And as she looked around, she realized that nothing here spoke of an ending. Nothing suggested abandonment or loss. Instead, everything felt paused. Like a sentence left unfinished. Waiting for the one voice that could complete it. And in that stillness, she understood that some journeys do not end when they disappear. They continue quietly, out of sight. Until someone is willing to follow them all the way through. Margaret stepped fully inside the rail car. Her movements slow and careful, as though she were entering a place that did not belong to time in the same way the world above did. And the air around her held that same faint warmth. Subtle but steady. Like the echo of someone who had not entirely left. She lowered herself onto the bench across from the coat. Her flashlight resting beside her. Its beam now soft against the worn interior. And for a moment she simply listened. Because the quiet here was different. It was not empty. It carried something beneath it. A presence that could not be seen but could be felt in the way the space seemed to hold its shape. Ranger did not move. His head still resting against the fabric. His body relaxed in a way she had never witnessed before. As if the long stretch of waiting had finally found its answer. Not in words, but in closeness. Margaret reached toward the coat. Her fingers brushing lightly against the sleeve. And beneath the aged material she felt something tucked inside. A folded piece of paper pressed close to the lining. And with careful hands she drew it out. Unfolding it slowly as the faint pulse in the air seemed to steady itself around her. The handwriting was the same. Deliberate and calm. But the words were different now. Softer. As though written by someone who had already come to terms with what lay ahead. If you are reading this, it means the sound led you here too. And she paused.
Keep watch,
her
buddy.
breath catching gently as her eyes moved across the page. I stayed longer than I thought I would, but I was not alone, not really, because I knew he would wait. And I needed to leave something behind that could be found when the time was right. Margaret lowered the paper slightly. Her gaze shifting to Ranger. Who lifted his head just enough to look at her. His eyes clear, calm, and certain. And in that moment she understood that whatever Ethan had followed into this hidden place had not taken him away. It had simply changed the way he could return. The faint rhythm softened. Not fading, but settling. Like a heartbeat that no longer needed to call out. And Margaret felt it then. A quiet certainty spreading through her chest. That the waiting had not been in vain. It had been a bridge. And now, finally, something on the other side had answered. When Margaret finally stepped back out of the rail car, the air in the chamber felt different. Not because anything had changed in form. But because something had settled into place. Like a long-held note finally resolving into silence. And behind her, Ranger remained for a moment longer. His head still resting against the coat. His body completely still as if listening one last time to something only he could hear. Then, slowly, he lifted himself. Turning with a quiet grace that carried none of the tension he had held for so many years. And as he stepped down onto the stone floor, he did not look back at the seat. Not at the coat. Not at the space that had held the echo of a man who had never truly left. Because whatever he had been waiting for was no longer behind him. The faint rhythm that had guided them here softened until it became indistinguishable from the natural silence of the underground. Not gone, but no longer calling. As though its purpose had been fulfilled. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside her coat. Her hands steady now. Her breath even. And together they made their way back through the tunnel. Their footsteps quiet. The path no longer uncertain but familiar. As if it had always been meant to be walked in both directions. When they emerged into the early morning light above the station, the sky stretched wide and pale over Red Hollow. The first hint of sunrise touching the rusted rails with a soft glow. And for a moment Margaret paused at the edge of the platform, looking out toward the curve where the tracks disappeared into the trees. Ranger moved beside her. But he did not take his old place near the edge. He did not sit facing the distance as he had done every day for nearly 10 years. Instead he stood close. His posture relaxed. His gaze drifting across the station as if seeing it not as a place to wait, but as a place he had already passed through.
Keep watch, buddy.
A gentle breeze moved across the
something in
platform, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and morning air. And somewhere in that quiet, there was no longer a sense of absence. Only a calm presence that needed no proof. Margaret rested her hand lightly against Ranger's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. And she understood then that some promises are not measured by the moment they are fulfilled, but by the faith it takes to keep them alive until they are. Ranger took a few steps forward, then paused, turning his head once toward the tracks. Not in longing, not in hope, but in quiet acknowledgement. Before